Welcome, everyone. My name is Fanny Robin. I am part of the French American Foundation in the United States, and I have the pleasure to welcome you today to our online economic discussion about the global coronavirus recession. So we are very honored to have with us today Gregory Daco, Chief US Economist at Oxford Economics, and a recipient of the 2019 Forecast Accuracy Awards. So he will discuss one of the most pressing issues of the moment, which is the impact of COVID-19 on the US and the global economy. So thank you, Greg, for joining us.
Thank you.
I will first introduce Alexandre Chenesseau, who is a great friend of the Foundation and our moderator today. Then he will introduce our speaker, Gregory, and start the discussion. Alexandre is the managing director at Evercore Partners, a firm based in New York, where he advises corporate and private equity clients in Asia, Europe, and North America on cross-border mergers and acquisitions. Prior to Evercore, Alex worked at Lazard for 8 years in Paris, Beijing, and New York, where he focused on financial and strategic advisory for clients in the media, telecom, and technology sector. He is an alumnus of Chenesseau Paris and Harvard Business School. Also, Alex is passionate about international business and policy matters, especially issues related to the US, France, and Asia, where he has lived for more than 12 years. He also supports initiatives related to development and cultural exchange with respect to Cuba, where his mother was born. He is both French and American with his parents, and has been an active member of the French American Foundation's Transatlantic Forum from the beginning. So for those who are not familiar with it, our Transatlantic Forum assembles professionals of all backgrounds to advance dialogue between France and the United States. And we are very thankful for Alexandre's continuing support to our program. So thank you, Alexandre. So thank you again to both of you for joining us. We are very excited to hear Gregory's insights about this urgent topic, especially in the present context of uncertainty. I'm sure Alexandre has a lot of questions for you, Greg. Well, I know he has a lot of questions for you. Also, we encourage all of you to participate and ask your question using the Q&A button on your screen. So now, Alexandre, I'm going to let you introduce Gregory and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Fanny, and the whole French American Foundation team for hosting this webinar and keeping us informed and intellectually engaged in these interesting times. I hope everybody's well and safe. So I'll start off by saying, ever since COVID-19 has severely struck our economies and that a large portion of the global population has been forced down into lockdown, we've all been trying to understand the intersection between the ongoing health crisis and the current and future situation of the global economy. In the US, we all saw the numbers in April for the April jobs report released on Friday. The levels of unemployment that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, effectively. There has been strong indication that things will actually get worse in May, but we can get back to that. So I think to dissect the current economic situation in the US, as well as the social and political implications going forward, we're absolutely delighted to have Gregory Daco, who, as Fanny mentioned, is the chief US economist at Oxford Economics, where he's responsible for producing the US economic outlook using Oxford Economics' proprietary global economic model. Greg leads a team that conducts thematic research on the economy, the Fed, and fiscal policy. He conducts regular briefings on the global economy for corporate boards, trade associations, and policymakers at all levels. He's often quoted in national and global publications and is a frequent guest of CNBC, Bloomberg, and NPR. Prior to joining Oxford Economics, Greg was a director of US macroeconomics at IHS Global Insight. He also worked in the Economic Affairs Department of the Belgium Embassy in Australia and the permanent representation of Belgium to the UN in Geneva. Greg is a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Business Economics and former president of the New York chapter of NAAB. He completed his education at Boston University and at the Université de Louvain in Belgium. So Greg, the floor is yours. We'll be talking, we'll be hearing Greg for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then, as Fanny mentioned, please do submit your questions in the Q&A function. And we're glad to have what is going to be an interesting conversation. Take it away, Greg.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you very much to the French American Foundation for hosting this webinar. It's always a pleasure to share ideas and views with a broad audience and hear feedback as to how people are actually living through what is a unique crisis, a unique recession. I thought I'd start off by highlighting some of the components of the global coronavirus recession that we're living through. I think there are three defining characteristics that are important to highlight. The first one is that this is very much akin to a natural disaster, in the sense that what we're seeing is very sudden and unexpected. We're also seeing the characteristic of a terrorist attack, in the sense that there's a tremendous fear factor and a lingering uncertainty as to the future development of the virus and how contagion will evolve in the coming months, the coming years. And then there's a third element which has highlighted, exacerbated even the shock, which initially was some severe financial market stress, which exacerbated the impact on the real economy. And so we're left with this highly unusual type of shock to the US economy and to the global economy, which is characterized by these three simultaneous dimensions. And when you think about the global coronavirus recession, you have to think about two very potent elements that are influencing economic activity. The first one that Alex mentioned is the lockdowns across the entire world. What started out as a shock that was seen as purely a shock for China, with a massive lockdown of 1 billion people in the country, rapidly evolved into a lockdown that spread across the world. First in Italy, then in the rest of Europe, and then finally in the United States and across a number of emerging markets after that. And so what we have today is an environment where much of the global economy has come to a sudden stop because of the lockdown. But it would be misguided to just assume that the lockdown is the unique reason for the recession that we're seeing. Yes, the lockdown is a big part of that, but the other factor, which is very important and ties back into the characteristics of this recession, is the fact that you have this uncertainty, this fear factor. And we're seeing it today in the United States, where while some states are gradually reopening their economies, economic activity is not really bouncing back to what it was a couple of months ago. And if anything, it remains pretty much subdued relative to normal trends, which shows that even beyond the lockdown, if you tell people to go out and spend, unless they feel safe to do that, they're not necessarily going to be doing so. So when we think about the virus overall, I thought it was useful to think about the number of cases at a global level and what we're seeing in terms of testing and developments in the US. So from a broad perspective, we have over 4 million cases globally, with nearly 1.5 million cases in the United States and nearly 80,000 deaths. Now we're heading towards an environment where there's going to be clearly probably double that in terms of total cases, and hopefully not, but it seems very likely that we're going to surpass 100,000 deaths in the United States and move even slightly beyond that. And the reason why I'm saying that is because it's very important to understand the development of the virus itself to understand the economic consequences, because we should not lose sight that this is first and foremost a health crisis. This is a crisis that's been caused by a pandemic. And until we find a health solution to what is a health crisis, there won't be a return to normal. And so we shouldn't expect the economy to just bounce back and return to what it was even once the lockdowns are relaxed, because there is still going to be that fear factor until we find either a solution in the form of testing and tracing, or a solution in the form of therapeutics, or a solution in terms of vaccines. And we know that that's going to take time, months, if not years. Hopefully this will come rather soon, but I think we have to keep in mind that that's a key element that may transform the economy, the global economy, in the coming months. Now, encouragingly, in the United States, we've made some good and some encouraging progress in terms of testing. We're now testing about 300,000 people on a daily basis, which is a strong number. And perhaps more importantly, the positive rate, the number of people that are tested and show up as positive for the COVID infection, is dropping. It's now around 14%. It was 2 to 3 times that in the initial phase of testing, which means that we're testing more and more people, and we have a better grasp of how the virus is spreading through our economy. So now that we have this perspective on how the virus has evolved, I think it's important to highlight the damage that's been done by the coronavirus recession. The first element that's important to note is that we had been in the longest economic expansion on record. The US economy had been growing for over 10 years since the financial crisis of 08 and 09, which is essentially over 120 months of continuous expansion, 129 months to be precise, of continuing expansion, which was the longest stretch of growth we had ever experienced for the US economy. And that came really to a sudden stop. If we had to pinpoint the real start of this recession, it's probably in the second half of March for the United States. You could actually be very, very precise and almost say it's around the 16th to 17th of March that this recession started, because that's when essentially you saw a massive drop-off in spending. And it's not related to the lockdowns. The lockdowns, even in New York, only came a little bit later. You already saw a sharp drop in spending tendencies because of the fear factor that came around the middle of March. Now, how big is this shock? It's a massive shock. If you think about it from a broad perspective, a historical perspective, the drop in terms of GDP is going to be about 3 times as large as what we experienced during the financial crisis, 3 times as large as the drop in GDP that we experienced over 2 years during the financial crisis. This has been experienced in a matter of a month, 2 months roughly. That's how severe the drop is in terms of economic activity. And if you put it on a historical scale going back 100 years, this is the 3rd most severe contraction in economic output over the last 100 years. The next one is the World War Two Demobilization, when a lot of people came back in the US after having fought the war and didn't have a job, and when government spending pulled back quite sharply. That was a severe recession right after World War II. But before that, we're talking Great Depression. We're talking 1929, 1930, 1931, where economic activity contracted about 25%. Right now, we're looking at a drop of GDP that's about 12%. So about half of the Great Depression, but 3 times worse than the global financial crisis. And that was already visible very early on in terms of the timing. We already saw a big drop in economic activity as early as the months of March. And while some forecasters, including myself, expected most of the drop in activity to really occur at the start of the second quarter in April, we already saw massive drops in spending in industrial production as early as March. If you look at some of the data on spending on retail sales, if you look at some of the industrial production data, some of these numbers were the largest declines on record, or in other cases, the largest decline since World War II. Now, the United States has the advantage of having a lot of data going back a number of years, and we have the ability to compare over time. But just that notion that the drops in activity in March, which is when we started to hear more and more about the virus and the fear started to take hold. In March, the drops in spending and industrial production were the worst in at least 70 years, at least since World War II. So a big, big hit to economic activity across a broad range of sectors. It's not just consumer spending on travel, on retail, on hospitality, and on restaurants. It's a broad range of spending categories that have been affected, going from the healthcare, the elective healthcare sector, going to the dentist or the chiropractor or any form of elective medicine has really not taken place since the second half of March, but it also pertains to spending on categories that we might not necessarily have first thought of as the most significantly impacted, like spending on cars, and spending even on overall buying of food. There's been an increase in grocery store purchases, but not so much in the broader sense of the food sector. So a big element that we have to understand is how big the income impact is. Because I've talked about two factors that are part of this shock, this initial shock in terms of the coronavirus recession, which is the lockdown and the fear factor. But there's a third factor, which is going to be much more important on the rebound, which is the income factor. Because Americans tend to spend within their means plus the credit capacity, the spending capacity that they are allocated via their credit cards or via the ability to borrow to buy a car or to buy a washing machine. Importantly, if income falls very sharply and does not recover rapidly, even if people are not on lockdown and are not fearful anymore, they might not have the means to spend. And that's going to be a key driver of the rebound in economic activity. So the element I want to touch upon right now is how income is going to evolve in the coming months. As Alex pointed out, on Friday last week, we had the worst payrolls report ever. We had a drop of 20.5 million jobs. 20.5 million jobs were lost in the month of April. That's a massive loss of employment. Just to put things in context again, that's twice as many jobs as we lost during the 08-09 financial crisis, twice as many in 1 month. In the financial crisis, it took 2 years to lose 9 million jobs. Here in 1 month, we lost 20.5 million. And just to add the March numbers, which we had the prior month, that's 21.4 million jobs that were lost over the period of 2 months. To give another comparison, that's as many jobs as we created over the last 10 years. So you take the last 10 years of job growth and you wipe it out in a couple of months. That's how severe the drop in employment was. And it may just be the tip of the iceberg, because when we look at the number of people that are filing for unemployment claims, we're looking at about 1 in 5 people in the labor force that are currently filing for unemployment claims. There have been 33 million people filing for unemployment claims over the last 7 weeks. Those are numbers that are unprecedented. The peak in terms of claims back in the Great Recession was 680,000. We're talking millions here. These are uncomparable numbers. Even if we look at the unemployment rate, which reached 15%, which is an all-time high and the largest surge in 1 month, even that is understated, because there are people that are working part-time when really they want full-time jobs. There are people that are discouraged or marginally attached because they haven't been looking for a job in the last few weeks. There are a lot of people that are believed to be on temporary layoffs, whereas in reality, there are very little odds that they actually return back to work. That is going to be key, because that's going to leave a big mark on income growth, and in turn, that's going to lead to slower spending on the rebound side. And I would note, as an anecdote, that the savings rate is perhaps the better guide as to how people will spend going forward. Precautionary savings surged. We had the highest savings rate in March at 13%, which shows that people are really putting a lot of money aside and fearing for the worst. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of the rebound. It's going to be a very gradual rebound. And I think that's perhaps the final point I wanted to highlight, is that as we've had a lot of stimulus put into the economy, we're going to see a rebound in economic activity, but it's going to be hesitant. In terms of stimulus, we've had 2 forms of stimulus. We've had the Fed, the Federal Reserve, intervening with its lending powers. The Fed does not spend, it lends money. It has done 3 main things to try to boost the economy. The first one is lowering interest rates, so the policy rate has been essentially slashed to 0. The second one is the so-called QE, so purchasing treasuries and asset-backed securities. And the third one is a slew of emergency lending facilities, lending to different sectors of the economy, and ensuring that on top of the real hit to the economy that we were seeing, this did not transform into a fully fledged financial crisis, the third element that I highlighted, the third characteristic that I highlighted. The Fed acted very rapidly, very early, and I think did a great job in ensuring that on top of the hit to activity that we were seeing, we didn't see a freeze in the credit markets and a freeze in financial intermediation, which would just have added another layer of complication and stress on the economy at this stage. So that's the first element of monetary policy stimulus. The second element of stimulus is fiscal, and that has also been unprecedented. Congress has passed over $3 trillion of fiscal stimulus in just a few weeks. It's not just the size, but it's the speed. The combination of the size and the speed are unprecedented for Congress, which is generally very slow to react to crises in this environment. It's put forward a lot of stimulus, and Congress has the spending powers. Contrary to the Fed that has the lending powers, Congress has the spending powers, and it's essential. And while some people are saying that this is stimulative, that this will really stimulate the economy on the upside, I would tend to have a slightly different view, that the spending by Congress is actually preventing a deeper hole in the economy. It's not yet stimulating because if you think about it, people can't really spend. They don't necessarily have the ability to spend, whether they want it or not, because of the income loss, but because also they're locked down. They're not going to go out to a restaurant and spend as they used to. So what we're really trying to do is have Congress spend as much money as possible to try to alleviate the hardships and the pain on those that have lost their jobs, that are impacted negatively by reduced hours or reduced salaries, and try to prevent an even deeper hit to economic activity on top of what we're seeing. And so as we consider these policies, we have to think about the rebound. Our view right now is that the economy will rebound very gradually, that we're going to see the same type of output activity that we used to at the end of 2019, only around the second half of 2021. It's going to be a very gradual recovery, but I would note, and this is very important, that the risks are skewed to the downside. There's a possibility that we start to see some corporate defaults, that we start to see some downgrades and defaults that play out with each other, and that leads to even lower employment, lower spending, and that feeds on itself, which could have a financial market element to it. Or we could see a second wave of contagion. Those are just two examples of downside risks. The second wave of contagion would come if people started to go out too rapidly, if we started to see, as we are sadly seeing in some states, a lack of precaution, and there is a second wave of infection, that might lead authorities to essentially re-implement lockdowns and lead to a further pullback in economic activity with perhaps a more severe damage on the economy down the line in the long run. So those, I think, are very important things to consider when we think about the broader picture of this global coronavirus recession. It's multifaceted. It has defining characteristics which are quite unique, and it will mean that we will likely go through a very gradual rebound when it comes to emerging out of this recession. So I wanted to kind of set the scene in terms of some of these key elements, and perhaps open it up for some questions.
That's great, Greg. Thank you very much for that. It's a good overall picture, and actually there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe what I'll do is I'll go back to one of the final points you were making around the government intervention. So you mentioned that the U.S. government stepped in for over $3 trillion US. We know it started with the CARES Act passed in March 2020, and that was already $2.2 trillion, which is much bigger than 10 years ago, and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and for comparison, that was $787 billion US. So an unprecedented intervention by the US government. But I'd be curious to get your thoughts on how that package, if you will, is structured and how it's been designed. There's been a lot of politics in Washington around what goes in, what goes out, strings attached. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on just the overall design of it, and if we can already see certain results that lead to the fact that we may want the government to step in further in certain areas more than others.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really important to understand what's happening in DC in terms of stimulus. I see two key elements to the response to your question. The first one is, one thing I alluded to, is the unprecedented speed and magnitude of the stimulus package that we've seen from Congress. Your comparison is very well placed, because if you think about it, we actually had 4 phases already of stimulus from Congress over the last month and a half. Essentially from the start of March, there was a first bill that was passed worth $8 billion, which is tiny in the grand scheme of things, but then a second one that was worth around 140 billion, followed by the CARES Act, which was worth 2.2 trillion, and then followed by another act that was worth just over $400 billion. So in total, it's above $3.1 trillion passed over about 4 weeks, which is historically very rapid and very large. It's nearly 25 to 30% larger than the cumulative spending over 2 years during the Great Financial Crisis, which included the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, but also included other different measures. Now, I think I usually use an image to compare, the size and the speed of the stimulus in this case, to contrast with what's happened in the past. And I was brought back to this image of the Australian swimming team back in the days where Ian Thorpe was an Olympic record breaker, where they showed the Olympic team training in terms of doing laps, and they were doing rapid laps. And then at one point they put a crocodile in the pool. And the speed at which the swimmers swam was just increased because they were fearful for their lives, and they wanted to get out of the pool as rapidly as possible. The image is important because we're faced with a unique crisis, something that we've never really experienced in our lifetimes. And even comparisons to the Great Depression aren't exactly the same because there's this health dimension. But the point is that when the conditions necessitate such a large investment, we really need Congress to act rapidly. We need them actually to act a little bit faster than they are acting. There have been different dimensions to the fiscal spending that we've seen. There's been checks to individuals. There's been an increase of unemployment benefits with $600 coming from the federal government on top of existing benefits. There's been the small business loans, the Paycheck Protection Program. There have been funds for healthcare issues. And there have been lowering of corporate tax obligations. All taken together, they're very good. But I sense, and this is the second element, I sense a stimulus fatigue sentiment in DC. You're hearing more and more these echoes of, we need to dial back spending. We need to make sure we're not overspending. This is absolutely not the time to be considering pulling back on stimulus. The economy is actually troughing right now, and this is the time where you should be doing more and more to try to prevent an even deeper hole for the economy. So if anything, I would support measures that would essentially extend the unemployment benefits, extend payment to families that have been affected, and tie those to employment developments. You could say, well, if the unemployment rate doesn't fall below, let's say 10%, then you don't dial back, the stimulus, or graduate it as the unemployment rate gradually returns to a more normal and better state. Then you pull back some of the aid. But I sense there is some fatigue. We know that the House will pass a bill worth over $2 trillion on Friday, or at least try to. But I'm not sure that will be taken up by the Senate, and much less by the White House at this stage.
Right. And actually, going back to the points you were mentioning about unemployment, so we all agree that there needs to be an element of comfort. And as soon as you reopen the economy, you need people to go back and spend. You need people to go back to their normal business and lives. And so you gave us an indication around the timing, more or less, of that. And I think you mentioned 2021. But in the near term, how can the U.S. economy actually absorb that shock of unemployment? I mean, we were talking about the fact that we might be somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% soon. How can the U.S. economy in the near term absorb that shock? And when we reopen, what you had mentioned around downside risks. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit in terms of the rebound? Yeah.
So, I mean, just to put the numbers in perspective, the unemployment rose to 14.7% on Friday last week for the month of April. So 14.7 was the highest unemployment ever, at least since the Great Depression, but we didn't have monthly data at that point. And it's the largest increase, monthly increase in the unemployment rate. But there are a few caveats that I think are very important in the context of this discussion. The first one is that the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which gathers the information, noted that had people responded to the survey in a better way, essentially not saying that they were away from work but still employed when they were actually unemployed, that unemployment rate would have been 5% higher. So we're looking at 19.7 if we readjust for that. The second element, which is important, and I briefly alluded to, is the fact that the unemployment rate perhaps does not capture the extent of the damage to the labor market. So a 20% unemployment rate means that 1 out of 5 people in the labor force is unemployed. But you have to add to that a few million people. So first of all, you have to add the people that are discouraged. So as many as 10 million people were discouraged in the last report. So not looking for a job, but essentially they were employed the prior month. So that's another 10 million on top of the 20 million that we lost. And then you have a series of people that are working part-time when they want full-time jobs. Again, that's for economic reasons. That's not because they want to work part-time. That's because of the unique nature of this crisis, which has forced a lot of businesses to consider cash flow. And when cash flow is of essence, you tend to dial back hours, put people on furlough, and in some cases, and this is very unusual, cut back on wages, either defer wages or reduce wages, which is highly unusual. So you have that additional layer of people that are working part-time when actually they would like full-time jobs. And when you add all the different components of the people that are underemployed, that are not employed to their likings, and the people that were miscounted, you're looking at 35 to 40 million people that are affected. So very, very large numbers. How do we get out of this? Well, we need to ensure that these people that have been unemployed have the means to spend once things improve. That means providing unemployment benefits that last more than 2 months. As of right now, the unemployment benefits will end at the end of June. The extended unemployment benefits, the federal $600 per week that have been added on top of the existing benefits, those end at the end of June. If that happens, then a lot of people from one day to the next will essentially have no more source of income, or at least a much lower source of income. One of the nice features I thought of the unemployment benefits is that if you add the state benefit plus the federal $600 per week, in some cases that's higher, that's a replacement salary or replacement wage that's higher than their previous salary, which ensures to some extent that people are still able to continue their normal activities, buying food, paying rent, doing basic things. That's very important to think about the rebound. But if you think about the broader sense of the hit to the labor market that we've seen, it's very likely that a lot of people are not going back to their jobs. A lot of people in this survey, the latest survey, about 90% of the people said they were on temporary layoff. That's not going to be the case. A lot of these temporary layoffs are going to become permanent. Because if you think about the restaurants or the small retailer that's down your street that hasn't been able to reopen, they're not going to reopen at 100%. They're going to be working at 30, 40, 50% capacity. And even in the states that are reopening and relaxing lockdown measures, we're looking at capacity rates at 20, 25%. Restaurants can't survive in that environment. So they're not going to rehire their full workforce. They might have, to preserve their workforce, rehired some people as they got the PPP, the small business loan. But beyond that, I'm not sure they will. So we have to think about fiscal stimulus that ensures the transition away from phase 1, which was a lockdown, towards phase 2, which is the relaxation of the lockdown, and then phase 3, which is the normalization process once the health solution is found to this problem. It's going to take time, and I think there will be a permanent loss to the economy in terms of small business dynamism, in terms of employment, and that's really what we have to be careful of. Because if the economy rebounds partially and then flattens because essentially a lot of people's incomes have been affected, business dynamism has been hurt, then we enter a much more precarious situation.
So you mentioned very rightly, a lot of people being able to go back to their jobs, and certain, hopefully when things normalize, companies reopening at closer to higher capacity. But one thing that I'm concerned about is the amount of jobs that are permanently lost. there's been a lot of talk about certain industries declining structurally, and there are many examples. You mentioned retail. All the tech companies and the e-commerce companies have been doing fairly well these days. But there's other industries, the cinema industry, for example. Will people want to go back to the movies instead of watching Netflix or going to all these online platforms? So it's probably a hard question to predict. But what's your sense on the amount of jobs that will actually be permanently lost after COVID, and what does that entail in terms of retraining people to go back to different jobs, and do we need the government to step in for that, or is that something that the market itself can help with? Curious to get your thoughts on that.
So let me first say that I think we have to be very careful with this idea that the invisible hand solves all the problems. There isn't necessarily the type of automatic retraining and retooling of an economy past a recession. We learned that the hard way from the Great Recession, where it took many years to recoup the 9 million jobs that we had lost over the crisis. It took about 5 years to recoup the jobs that we had lost during the Great Recession, 5 years. So that's a massive amount of time. And I think we have to be very careful with this idea that people will retrain themselves and be reallocated to the right sectors. There is some of that happening, but not necessarily very rapidly. In terms of your broad question, I think there are a number of interesting topics in terms of how the economy is structured in the next few months, in the next few quarters, in the next few years. Certainly, all the elements of economic activity that pertain to face-to-face interaction or close interaction with people are going to be the last ones to be relaxed, or the last ones to come back online as they used to. I don't expect movie theaters to reopen and fully pack a room. They might reopen and space people by 2-3 seats and different rows like airlines are thinking about. But there are going to be dramatic shifts in the way these different sectors evolve. The retail sector in particular is one that was already facing a structural decline. If you look at the amount of spending that was happening in brick and mortar stores, at malls or at big merchandise stores, those were declining very steadily. And what you were seeing was a gradual increase in the amount of spending that was done online. Now, we only have March data so far for the retail sector, but already there we saw the biggest surge in the share of spending that was done online. That's no surprise to anyone on this call that a lot of us have been buying food online, have been ordering different things online instead of going to the store because we feel rather safe for doing so. That trend, I think, is going to continue, and perhaps the acceleration in that trend is likely to continue. But I do want to push back a little bit against the idea that we're not going to do any social activities anymore. I think, at the core, we are social animals. We like interactions. And for the most part, we like face-to-face contact. I know a lot of us in lockdowns in the major cities, in New York in particular, we really thrive to interact with other people, whether it's having a drink, going to the restaurant, going to the gym, going to see a movie. We like that aspect of our lives, and we like the social aspect of that. So I would be careful to assume that because of the pandemic, we're going to move completely away from the social dimension of our spending activities. I think we still like to do that. And case in point, you may have seen that in Shanghai, they're reopening Disneyland, and people are coming. Now, attendance is very low, and it's going to take months, if not years, to get back to more normal levels, but people do want to go out and spend and do social activities. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful with the assumption that the crisis will completely shift our ways of behaving. There will be shifts. There will be shifts in the retail sector. There will be shifts in the real estate sector, which we can talk about too. But I think there will still be some desire to travel, some desire to travel for leisure or for work, and to meet people face to face.
Right. And to shift back to economics a little bit, I'm taking some questions from Anthony and Katie in the audience. Given the downside risks, do you expect any negative interest rates in the U.S.? And then, tangentially, what are the deflation risks in the coming year? And what would that mean for the average U.S. family?
Yeah, I actually just finished a note last week on the deflation threat, and I essentially said that inflation should not be a worry today. We should not be concerned about rising inflation. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. The first one, which we've been talking about, is the fact that this is really the largest demand shock that we've experienced in many decades. We're seeing a complete collapse of consumer spending activity. We're expecting overall consumer spending to contract by about 15 to 20%. I mean, that's unprecedented in normal times. So we're seeing a big pullback in spending on services, and there is that uncertainty factor, so that even once people are allowed to go out and spend again, they're going to be very cautious about how they spend. So even if they are given the authorization to go out and spend, they're going to be careful, and their income is going to be reduced. So they're going to be spending at a more reduced clip. And when you have that type of environment, you see a massive drop in prices. This morning we had the latest CPI data, and we had record drops, monthly drops in some of the subcategories. Core prices fell 4/10, which is something that we had never seen in the past. Airline fares, motor vehicle insurance, apparel, all falling 5, 6, 7%, which are 10 times the worst before that. So we're seeing big drops in a broad swath of spending categories that reflects both the economy slowing, but also the lockdown factor. Because people can't spend on apparel, and because by now, if you're changing seasons, the warm sweaters are not going to be any use anymore. Well, those prices are just plunging. Same thing for airfares. Nobody's buying, or very few people are buying airline tickets, and so you're seeing those prices drop dramatically. As an illustration, the TSA throughput in the United States is down about 95%. 95%. So you're really seeing that drop in spending, which in turn is influencing inflation. And so we're seeing a big pull, not just on the pro-cyclical components of inflation, those that react to economic activity or employment, but also those that may be a little bit acyclical. Spending on healthcare, elective healthcare really plunged in the month of March and April, and that's pulling down prices for elective healthcare. Now, other prices are rising, but elective healthcare is also one of those components that's being pulled down. Used car prices are falling too. We saw that Hertz was facing some difficulties, financial difficulties, and they're not buying any cars this year. So that's another drag on car prices. So a number of factors are weighing down on prices, and some people have called for inflation, spiraling inflation once the economy recovers. Well, I'd buy that if we had a V-shaped recovery, if we had tomorrow the same type of economy we had back in February. But I think I've illustrated that that's quite unlikely in the current environment. And so if we have spending that's permanently lower, income that's permanently lower, you're not going to see that spiraling out of inflation. Some people have talked about the Fed's massive injections of liquidity via quantitative easing and via its different emergency lending facilities, which has a firepower of over $4 trillion, which is quite a lot. It's about 20% of GDP to give you a sense of perspective. All those measures will lead to much sharper inflation. It's not true. If you look at how much these liquidity provisions are filtering through to the real economy, it's actually very small. Some businesses are borrowing more, but they're borrowing more to cover potential losses or to actually prevent a cash flow freeze, leading them to even more troubles. They're not spending that money. They're essentially keeping it and protecting themselves against a potential further downdraft in economic activity. So that money's not going out, and it's not going to generate inflation. And I would add a couple of things. First, on the fiscal front, yes, there's been, again, we talked about $3 trillion being pumped into the economy, about 15% of GDP. Could that be inflationary? Potentially. But again, it's filling a hole. It's not stimulative in the sense that we're not boosting an economy that's growing at 2%. We're trying to prevent an economy that's contracting at a 10, 12% clip from falling even further. And once the economy rebounds, a lot of these spending measures are going to be dialed back. And so we're going to see less spending as the economy recovers, so less of an inflationary risk on that front. And then finally, I think it's important to remember that even prior to the crisis, the pricing power in the US was very limited. We didn't really have that wage inflation dynamic where people were seeing tremendous increases in wages and companies were able to pass on those higher labor costs to consumers by raising inflation. If anything, over the past 10 years, inflation has been very much subdued. So I think really honestly, today, inflation is really not the concern. I'd be much more concerned about disinflation or deflation when prices fall rather than increase. And in terms of what that means for the Fed's going to be on hold, I mean, for an indefinite period of time and going to be providing further accommodation as need be. There's been a lot of talk about the Fed pushing the policy rate into negative territory. I don't really think that's what the Fed wants to do, and I don't think it would have a lot of firepower in terms of stimulating the economy at this stage. I don't think interest rates are really going to be a guiding principle right now in terms of how people spend. People are not going to care so much about an interest rate, a policy rate that's slightly below zero or not. It's going to hurt bank profits at a time where you probably don't need that. It may stimulate some credit lending, but again, who's spending? Not many people are spending. So I don't think the Fed really wants to go there. I think an alternative might be, and sorry for getting too technical, but the so-called yield curve control, where the Fed controls long-term interest rates. Perhaps that's something that they might look into, trying to prevent long-term rates, which are used for business investment purposes, and business investment loans are a good marker for mortgage rates. Perhaps they might try to control that on the downside, but I don't think they want to get there yet. I think they want to first see how the economy is faring with all the stimulus that's been pushed through, what happens in May, in June, in July, and if things turn for the worse, then intervene. But it's likely to intervene more specifically with emergency lending facilities rather than try to play too much with negative policy rates.
And Julia actually had a question on specifically on the real estate market. How do you see the real estate market reacting to the different elements? On the one hand, you have slower economic growth, obviously all the uncertainty related to the healthcare situation, and on the other, you have interest rate policies that we talked about. How do you see the market?
I think we have to distinguish residential from commercial. On the residential side, the initial impact actually was slightly stimulative because we are in a very tight housing market with limited inventory. So you're not seeing prices fall that much, but you saw the interest rates, the mortgage rates fall quite sharply. And that led to a lot of refinancing and some purchasing activity before the crisis hit, and a little bit still over the last few weeks. Even if you look at purchase applications in the last couple of weeks, they've actually rebounded. They troughed about 30-35% below where they were in February, but they've actually rebounded a little bit. So there is some encouraging news there. But again, the key factor is income. And if income is slow, then housing activity will be slow on the residential side. So I'd be very careful to assume much stronger activity. I think that there's going to be a big decline initially in housing activity. I wouldn't be surprised to see a 10-15% drop in overall housing activity on the residential side, and then a gradual rebound restrained by slow income and the fact that inventory is quite tight, and the fact that as a result, prices are relatively high. So I wouldn't be surprised to see less of a drop in house prices than we saw in 08, 09, where a big part of the crisis was concentrated in the real estate sector with balance sheets that were over leveraged and people having to clean up those balance sheets. That's not the situation today. That's not what we're seeing today. So I think the housing rebound on the residential side will be slow, but perhaps not, the trough won't be necessarily as deep as we previously saw. On the commercial real estate side, I think it's going to be a very delicate period for the commercial real estate side. And I say that as I've read a few anecdotes of companies reconsidering office work and work sharing plans, and how they approach their workforce in terms of where that workforce works. you might have seen that there have been a few announcements by some of the large companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons, talking about telling their employees not to come back, or that they won't have to return to their offices before. Some have said Labor Day, some have said October. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Google and Facebook have said 2021. And Nationwide yesterday announced that it would actually not reopen its offices. So there are going to be some potential shifts here. That's one of the things I was alluding to in terms of perhaps structural changes for some companies. Now, we have to keep in mind that these are tech and finance sector companies, which have always had a bit of a different take on how work is done. And in some cases, some companies, work can't be done remotely. But I think there will be shifts in terms of the commercial real estate sector. I would put a big caveat here that, yes, working remotely works, functions, if you're alone at home. But if schools are not reopening, which is a big issue, then you're not going to be able to work in that type of environment. So it's not just about businesses and companies saying to their workforce they can work from home. It's also making sure that there is an alternative to keeping the children either at school, or having alternatives to schools that allow people to really work and function effectively, because there's always going to be that trade-off from a business perspective. Do you want to risk a productivity decline of 10, 20, 30% if you have kids at home at the same time, and reduce your cost at the same time? And what's the larger? Or do you prefer to have people in their offices, at their desks, and hope or assume that kids are back in school?
So in the interest of time, I also wanted to make sure that we address one of the elephants in the room, which is the upcoming U.S. presidential election. And curious to get your thoughts on effectively where we stood before COVID-19. What's the situation today? What are the key factors that are going to play out in November, and how that shifts? And then Max from the audience had a question, I think more broadly, not only in the U.S. but also looking at Europe, and democratic processes more generally. How does the current situation affect the outcome of some of these elections that we'll be seeing in the next year or two, given all the uncertainty and economic challenges?
Yeah, I mean, forecasting is humbling, economic forecasting, but political forecasting is just another dimension. I won't venture into saying what will happen come November, but I will highlight some of the elements that may influence the elections. We have developed at Oxford Economics a couple of election models that are based on the economy. The idea being that people vote with their pocketbooks, that if the unemployment rate is low, if income growth is strong, and if inflation is subdued, then people will favor the incumbent party and vote for that party. That held relatively well through 2004. Back in 2004, we saw a dramatic shift in election preferences away from the economy and putting much more emphasis on voter turnout. So how each candidate, each party managed to motivate its base to come out and vote for the candidate that was in the run-up. So the two models are one national and the other one is regional. They're both popular vote models. The first one is national and just looks at the popular vote on a national basis. The second one is based on the electoral college votes and looks at each different state and how each different state might swing Democratic or Republican. What we saw before COVID was an environment in which the economy actually was working in favor of President Trump's reelection odds, because we had an unemployment rate at a 60-year low of 3.5%, because we had relatively decent income growth around 2%, and because we had relatively subdued inflation. All those factors across the nation in a rather homogeneous way were essentially favoring the reelection of President Trump. Now, we did note that at the regional level, voter turnout was going to be key, and that it wouldn't take much for voter turnout to be as high as the voter turnout during the Obama years for the Democratic Party, and that would swing the elections towards the Democratic Party. So essentially, yes, the economy was favoring Trump, but it wasn't doing so to a large enough extent that a slight shift in voter turnout in favor of the Democratic Party would allow them to win. Today, very different picture. We have the deepest recession we've seen in 100 years. We have an unemployment rate that's surged to the highest level ever. We have income growth that's plunging 10%, and we have inflation that's subdued, but not really mattering that much in this environment of a massive demand shock. And if anything, you could argue that the deflationary trend is actually a negative one. But keep that aside. For now, essentially the economy is completely weighed against President Trump, and no matter the turnout, actually, it seems like the economy would favor the Democratic candidate, which is right now Joe Biden. So it seems that the economy is really favoring the Democratic side. But we have to keep in mind that there are a number of unpredictable elements in this crisis. We don't know what the status of the contagion will be come November. We don't know what the real state of the economy is. We're trying to forecast, but we're forecasting in a truly humbling environment where we really don't know how things are going to evolve because we don't know how the health crisis is going to evolve. And we don't know what the messaging is going to be around the crisis itself. The approach right now from Biden has been really to keep relatively silent, and we haven't heard much of him. And if anything, we've heard much more of President Trump. This type of dynamic, I think, would favor the Democratic side, but let's just wait and see. I mean, I'll be very honest, I don't know how this is playing out, going to play out in terms of the virus. Assume we have a healthcare solution to this crisis, whether it's therapeutics or broad-based testing and tracing or a vaccine, who knows? If we're a bit optimistic, the economy could rebound faster. The president could say, well, I've managed the deepest crisis ever, and we're coming out of it. And that could be a completely different message. So we don't know. We don't even know if people will be able to go out and vote. I mean, will there be some remote form of voting? I don't know. I mean, there are a number of components. Right now, the economy leaning heavily against President Trump, but we have to wait and see how the crisis, the healthcare crisis, is going to evolve in the coming months.
And how do you see the dynamic play out between protectionism, which we've obviously seen in recent years, nationalistic positions that all these countries have been taking? We've seen it play out a little bit on at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis and how countries were trying to deal with it. Should we expect that countries will be taking more protectionist measures, or do you think that there is an element of globalization here that's still at play? And that could potentially help solve some of the economic growth challenges that we're going to be seeing in the coming months and years.
In times of difficulty, in times of hardship, in times of reduced economic growth and recessions, the tariffs that are put in place between countries tend to linger on for at least an additional year. We did a recent study where we looked at about 100 trade wars over the past 100 years, some bilateral, some multilateral. And what we found was that when growth is under potential, essentially it takes an additional year to remove the tariffs. We have this massive demand shock on our hands at a time when the US and China are fighting an unprecedented trade war. We still have tariffs on about 20% of our imports from China at different rates, but averaging above 15%, and in some cases 25% on some of the imports from China, including medical equipment. Now that was reversed recently, but there's been a lot of stress in the most recent days trying to put the blame of the virus on China and trying to tie the virus to trade tensions and the potential further implementation of tariffs. That's part of a messaging element, but I think it has real consequences for the economy. We expect trade flows to reduce by about 30%, just because of the crisis. Add to that a further escalation of the US-China trade war, and you could see a drop in trade of about 50%. That has major consequences for everybody that's involved in trade, but also people that are indirectly involved in trade. And in the end, we all are in this Amazon era where we're ordering things left and right. Trade is essential to our activity. And so I think we have to be very conscious of potential risk from a further escalation of trade tensions. It's not just the US and China, it's US and Europe, and in between countries outside of the US, this dynamic whereby the US has imposed this view of just wanting to implement tariffs if things are not going the way they want has propagated throughout the world. And there's a bit of that mentality of beggar thy neighbor in this environment of a recession, which is quite risky for the global economy.
So I think we're running out of time. So maybe I'll have one final question. Greg, you're an optimist. I try to be an optimist. And so maybe a couple final remarks, I think from your perspective in terms of what we should be, hopeful about. Obviously, we will come out of this, but any final comments that you might want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think we will come out of this, perhaps transformed, having lived a unique experience. But I think we have to draw upon some of the lessons from this crisis. There are different types of lessons, but I think one of the key lessons that we have to keep in mind is that we really have to be better prepared, and our policymakers in particular have to be better prepared to these types of once-in-a-lifetime shocks. We have to have the right policies with automatic stabilizers that allow countries to react very rapidly to changes in the economic outlook. Right now, what we're seeing and what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is a lot of scrambling, a lot of different governments doing different things, and no real coordination across the world. This is a time when coordination is actually of essence. If everybody put the world on lockdown, if you had a magical wand and said, everybody has to stay in place for 2 weeks, this virus would be over. But that's not possible. And we have not seen the type of coordination at the fiscal level, at the central bank level a little bit, but at the fiscal level across countries to try to generate that massive impulse all at the same time to try to prevent a deeper fall. Everybody's doing a little bit of what they think is right, and that is really not conducive to stronger growth. Even in the US, if you think about it, the fact that you have different states going about their ways with different criteria, different reasons for reopening will not lead to a homogeneous end to the virus. It's going to lead to different trends across the country, and people, once they resume traveling, that's going to spread again throughout the country. So I'm really fearful of the double dip. I know you wanted an optimistic end to this, but I think we will come back to this view of stronger growth, stronger economic activity, but we do require, in order to get back to that, we will require fiscal support from Congress in terms of addressing the stresses that are seen throughout the economy, ongoing support from the Fed, and eventually we will get back to some form of normalcy. And I think the hope we can put in is in the fact that in these times of stresses, our scientists and our medical staff are really putting a lot of effort in trying to stave off this crisis. And so I'm hopeful that in this type of stress, we really accelerate the pace at which we find a solution, whether it's a technical solution, which I call technical, but it's testing and tracing, or a therapeutics solution, which would essentially reduce the risks of dying from the virus, which is essentially the key element here, or a vaccine that prevents people from getting it and being contagious with it. I think all three aspects are things that I'm really hopeful for, and I think would allow for a much faster recovery because you'd essentially limit the fear factor and reduce the income hit because you'd shorten the crisis.
Great. Thanks a lot, Greg. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to address all of them, but I hope that everybody found this informative. And I think Val and the French American Foundation team had a few final comments regarding the upcoming schedule.
Yeah, so on behalf of all of us at the French American Foundation, thank you so much to both of you for joining us today and for everyone online who's been tuning in for such a topical discussion. Just one thing before we close, we'd like to announce our upcoming webinar this Thursday at 6 p.m. with New York Times writer and cookbook author Melissa Clark, who will be leading a virtual cooking class with all of us. So once again, thank you so much to everyone listening in, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.